Welcome to the final episode of the Copperhead Conspiracy. I'm Dan Gettleman. Most Americans know what happened at Washington's Ford Theater on April 14, 1865. During a performance of the play Our American Cousin, John Wilkes Booth fired a single shot into the head of President Abraham Lincoln, mortally wounding him, though he wouldn't die until the early morning hours of the following day. After firing his Derringer, Booth jumped from the balcony down to the stage of the theater, injuring his leg before escaping through a back door and jumping on a horse. After a multi-state manhunt that lasted 12 days, Booth was caught in a Virginia barn where he was shot and killed. In the aftermath, several of Booth's co-conspirators were arrested, tried, and hanged for their part in the plot. Those are the facts that most people agree on. And yet, for over 160 years, an untold number of books, dissertations, and articles have been written on the subject, examining it from every possible angle. For many scholars who have looked at the events covered in this series, one of the most vexing questions is whether and how to explore the possible connections between the Confederate government and those who participated in the Lincoln assassination plot. The problem is a lack of documentary evidence, a smoking gun, if you wish, that clearly makes this connection. But sometimes, as in the case of the Watergate scandal, it's easier to identify the evidence of a cover-up than of the crime itself. And that indeed seems to be the case here. A purposeful campaign to redirect attention away from the Confederacy began shortly after the assassination, when the U.S. government issued arrest warrants with large cash rewards for several Confederate leaders whom they believed had a role in the assassination. Journalist and author Julian Schur.
So about a month after the assassination, the new administration issues a kind of indictment, a conspiracy indictment, saying that Booth was just part of a wider conspiracy. And 5 of the 6 people they named are all in Canada. The only person not in Canada is Jefferson Davis, who, by the way, will eventually end up in Canada.
In addition to Davis, the arrest warrant named Confederate Commissioners Jacob Thompson and Clement Clay, William Cleary, who served as a secretary to Clement Clay, Beverly Tucker, who procured supplies for the Confederate Army, and an enigmatic Kentuckian named George Sanders, who had no official title, and yet was a force behind the scenes in the Confederacy for several years.
Sanders grew up in the South, a fairly prosperous family, worms himself into Confederate circles, and prior to the war, actually gets named as the U.S. ambassador to London, but gets into trouble because he openly talks in London about the righteousness of assassinating tyrants, words, of course, that will take on a lot more meaning during the Civil War. He is recalled, and when the Civil War breaks out, he openly decides to work for the South and makes his way to southern Ontario near Niagara Falls and establishes himself there as his second home. He becomes one of the main Confederate agents. George Sanders is the one who will help finance and raise the money to defend the Vermont Raiders. George Sanders also will meet with John Wilkes Booth when Booth comes here for 2 weeks in the fall of 1864. We know from eyewitness testimony the two of them meet and they're whispering in corners. We don't know what they talk about. Did Booth talk to Sanders about his idea of kidnapping Lincoln? That was Booth's idea at the time. Did George Sanders talk to Booth about the validity of assassinating tyrants? We don't know. But at that time, Sanders is chatting with John Wilkes Booth, and he's approached by a well-known British journalist, and he utters these words where he says, "We are talking about things that will make the world shudder in a few months."
It has been said of the Civil War that while the North won the war, the South won the peace. One of the ways this manifested itself was that former Confederates were largely successful in revising the narrative of the Civil War, especially removing the preservation of slavery as a primary goal of the South seceding from the United States. But another part of history they successfully rewrote was the assassination of Lincoln, away from any possible involvement of Confederate leaders and toward a lone gunman scenario, with no assistance for the assassin either before or after the shooting from any Confederate operative. And no one was more responsible for this than George Sanders.
The Confederate agents in Canada and the Confederate supporters all through the South obviously had a dilemma on their hand, because with the assassination of Lincoln, on the one hand, it was their wish come true, right? I mean, he was evil incarnate. That, I'm sure most of them must have been thrilled that their chief enemy had been assassinated. But like almost all conspiracies, the people involved, one way or the other, have to try to deflect the blame. George Sanders is named in the indictment as one of the conspirators. He, of course, claims his innocence, but then, being the conspirator, he hatches this wonderful plot, and he starts writing letters and documents that will be first published in Canadian papers and then spread all through the United States, where he says that Andrew Johnson, the vice president, would have been the person behind the plot. And that has been a story that has reverberated to this day.
George Sanders then engineered yet another coup of misdirection.
In the wake of Lincoln's assassination, the nation, of course, is reeling in horror and shock. And there are these massive conspiracy trials against the assassins. But the prosecutors wanted to try to widen the attack and tried to accuse Jefferson Davis and several of the leaders in Canada as direct conspirators. And there were several witnesses, Union spies, Confederate agents, who gave quite gripping testimony. They testified that Jacob Thompson, the head of the Confederate Secret Service in Canada, knew about the assassination, was plotting, was part of the plot, had meetings with Booth, and it went on and on and on. And it looked like, they tied it up in a bow. This was amazing. What was later uncovered is that George Sanders, that wonderful manipulator, had in fact conspired and plotted with at least one of the witnesses to give knowingly false evidence. In fact, if you look at some of the evidence, it could not have been true, because he had claimed that John Wilkes Booth had met with Jacob Thompson when it physically wasn't possible. Jacob Thompson was not in the same city. There were other problems, letters that were claimed to have been sent that just had the wrong dates. The testimony was shoddy, but the prosecutors and frankly the political establishment were so keen to try to nail Jefferson Davis and the Confederate leaders with responsibility that they use these witnesses, and it blows up in their face. Now, politically, I think it's undeniable that Jefferson Davis and the other leaders played a role in the assassination, because they created the atmosphere, and in fact, they engaged and supported other plots against Lincoln. But legally, in a court of law, you are never going to prove that Jefferson Davis and Jacob Thompson and the Confederate agents in Canada directly conspired with John Wilkes Booth.
One person who definitely did conspire with John Wilkes Booth was John Surratt. And unlike his other co-conspirators, he faced few consequences for his involvement in the plot, although his mother Mary was one of the 4 people who were executed for the assassination. On April 14th, he was in Elmira, New York, on an unrelated mission for the Confederate Secret Service. When he learned of the assassination, he immediately crossed the border to Canada to evade capture by Union soldiers. While there, he got considerable help from a network of Catholic priests.
The Catholic Church in Quebec was very conservative, very traditional, and for a variety of reasons, sympathized with the South. Not necessarily because they supported slavery, but they certainly liked the class structure, the aristocracy in the South. They saw the South as this beleaguered minority. So Confederate agents had top alliances with senior church leaders. And thanks to those church leaders, Surratt is secreted out of Montreal and by boat lands up in a small village on the outskirts of the city called Saint-Liboire, where a sympathetic priest called Father Lapierre will hide him in his house for quite a long time.
For the next several months, a network of Canadian Catholics moved Surratt around the eastern part of Canada to avoid capture, eventually deciding to send him to Italy.
Thanks to letters they write, he gets a posting as a Zouave, which was the Pope's army in Italy. That's where he's sent. He hides out again for another year, thanks to the Catholic Church, is discovered there, brought back for trial in 1867. His trial is a civil trial, not a military trial like his mother and the other conspirators faced. And he gets acquitted by a jury of his peers.
We know what happened to John Surratt, to John Wilkes Booth, and to the 4 assassination conspirators who were executed. But what happened after the Civil War to the Confederate and Copperhead leaders who participated in these conspiracies? The short answer, just about nothing. A few of them served a bit of prison time near the end of the war. Others were exiled, most of them settling in Canada. But when President Andrew Johnson issued an amnesty for former Confederates willing to take a loyalty oath, most were able to return home. And after that, by and large, they all ended up falling upward. They became lawyers, judges, businessmen, senators, and congressmen. Confederate spy Thomas Hines became the Chief Justice of the Appellate Court in Kentucky. One Copperhead leader, Thomas Hendricks, even became Vice President of the United States under Grover Cleveland. And then there's Luke Blackburn, the guy who tried to start a yellow fever epidemic.
Blackburn is put on trial. You can imagine the headlines in the New York papers: terror plot, evil doctor. The case is largely thrown out. On a technicality, the Americans are apoplectic. Dr. Luke Blackburn, openly boasting about being the man behind the yellow fever plot, after he's put on trial and acquitted, makes his way to Kentucky, his home state, after the war, and he runs to become governor in 1879. So the northern papers, seeing that this man was now running for governor, they're aghast at it. They called him the hideous devil behind the black vomit scare, and they ran exposés. And again, in echoes of what we see today, Blackburn literally shrugs off the stories about him being involved in the yellow fever plot. He says those are too preposterous for intelligent gentlemen to believe. Blackburn gets elected, will actually become one of the most popular governors of Kentucky for 4 years until 1883.
When I first learned of this story, while researching another series, The Reckoning, the main thing I wondered was, why had I never heard about this before? How could such a consequential chapter in American history have become so obscure that most of the relevant books on the subject are long out of print, most having been written 75 or more years ago? And many of those that were written in recent decades largely dismissed the story as some combination of paranoid delusion and anti-Democratic Party propaganda. But early in the 21st century, a new generation of scholars started looking at this period with fresh eyes and came to very different conclusions. One of the first to do so was historian Jennifer Weber. I asked her why the story of the Copperhead movement had largely disappeared.
There was a historian who really started making his mark in the early 1960s named Frank Clement. And he was adamant that there was nothing nefarious going on with the Copperheads, that they had no interest in overthrowing the government, that this was an understandable dissenting movement that never posed any serious threat to the United States. And he was persuasive enough that historians just then let that go and didn't talk about the Copperheads really and didn't examine them. They would show up in a few paragraphs maybe of a book on the Civil War, but they didn't really have any deep examination for decades.
At the close of every interview I conducted for this series, I asked the same question. Why is understanding this part of American history at all important? Especially since most of what the Copperheads tried to accomplish in terms of violent revolution never came to pass, largely because of the efforts of Union spies. And how might these events from the 1860s be at all relevant to the times we live in today? I started by asking Patrick Lewis, the director of the Filson Historical Society in Louisville.
What this has led to, in retrospect, is an ongoing historical conversation that has lasted for over 100 years now among scholars who have looked back at these anti-governmental efforts and said, how real was this? Was this all just overblown conspiracy? Or was this actually real? And I think there's always an overpromising of these kind of terroristic groups, but as we can attest from our own day and time, they can also present a real danger to a civil government. You know, the institutions of American democracy are not as solid as we all hope they would be. And there are some fragile points that a well-committed and organized group of anti-governmental, treasonous actors can really target and bring down a government in peacetime, but especially in war.
You can't hide the past. The past is with us, continues to live with us. And if we don't recognize the truth of the past, then we're not going to understand the truth of today. And let me give you a very concrete example. In the wake of the Civil War, a group is formed called the United Daughters of the Confederacy in the 1890s, with the deliberate attempt to make sure that schools and churches and in the public mind, the history of the Civil War would not see the South as slave owners. They literally wrote guidebooks, and I'm quoting, they literally said, reject any book that says the South fought to hold her slaves. Reject a book that speaks of the slaveholder of the South as cruel and unjust to his slaves. This is important because everything we've been talking about, it's not just who wins the war, but who wins the history of the war. In Florida today, there are new mandates for how you teach history. And this is a literal quote from the guideline that they're putting out for books in Florida today. It says, in addition to agricultural work, enslaved people learned specialized trades and worked as painters, carpenters, tailors, musicians, and healers in the North and South. Once free, African Americans used these skills to provide for themselves and others. That's the lost cause. We have politicians today forcing schools to rewrite the history the same way Confederate sympathizers did in the 1890s.
So often the story that we tell as a nation is a binary story. And from a Northern perspective, it's often told that the North was good and the North fought to end slavery, and that the South was bad and fought to preserve slavery. And that just leads Southerners to not wrongly have a chip on their shoulder, that somehow the racial sins of the nation are all laid at their feet, and that the Northerners get off scot-free. So I find it really important to talk about how terrified white Northerners were at the idea that freed Black people were going to be coming across the river, because it helps us understand that the North was not fighting to end slavery as an initial war aim. And even at the end of the war, just because they were fighting to end slavery didn't mean they were fighting for racial equality. And that sets us up to understand the lasting impact of racial tensions and racial violence for the next 160 years. We continue to see this today. The idea that the Civil War in some way solved the racial problem of the United States, or that following the Civil War, Black people had freedom, and what more should they want? And that somehow assisting Black people who had been enslaved and ended slavery with nothing, that's a handout. If there's still a wealth inequality today, that's their own fault. It's not the fault of any of the structures that existed pre-Civil War, during the war, and after.
It's a really tricky thing to telescope the past to the present. But in this case, it's instructive, because what we see in this moment are some of the same political divisions, particularly in the Midwest right now, that we saw in 1861 to 1865 and beyond. What I found is that the political divisions that divided Republicans from Peace Democrats or Copperheads became the foundation for the post-war politics within these states between Democrats and Republicans, that found them contesting election after election by using and reopening war wounds. And in many ways, those kinds of divisions will persist in a place that unfortunately we've interpreted as being all for the Union. But within these states themselves, there was this kind of perpetual tension and outright strife about the future of the nation. Even the word Midwest kind of comes out of a recognition that this old Northwest is a place of two lives of small towns that are supposed to be progressive and middle class and kind of stable and bucolic. And then you've got the rest of the Midwest, a Midwest of sundown towns, a Midwest of racial animosity and lynchings, a dark place. It's a Midwest that unfortunately right now has shown that darker side in ascendance.
In my opinion, the importance of understanding history is at least twofold. Number one is to understand the complex nature of the United States in all its good points and not so good points. It's important to know the entire story. The second point is, if folks don't learn about history, it's not like that history repeats itself, but it does repeat itself. So you want to understand history because you have these themes that reoccur. And so understanding that history is that nothing new happens under the sun. It's the same old, same old. The question is, we haven't learned from our past, so we don't do better. It's like my grandmother says, you do better when you know better.
Those were historians Patrick Lewis, Julian Schur, Shannon Smith, Chris Phillips, and Eric Jackson. There are many reasons to find the events outlined in this series to be worth studying 160 years after the fact. Consider what could happen if a president today suspended our basic civil liberties, as Lincoln did during the 1860s. Would Congress allow that? What about the Supreme Court? What kind of backlash might occur, perhaps violent in nature, among the citizens? And what type of spiral toward dictatorship could that backlash lead to? The story of the Copperheads during the Civil War is, in many respects, a cautionary tale, with lessons for all of us to think about and perhaps to learn from. The Copperhead Conspiracy is a production of Reckoning, Inc., with funding and scholarly assistance from Ohio Humanities. It was produced and narrated by me, Dan Gettman. Our historical consultant was Dr. Stephen Rockenbach. Voice actors were Alec Voles and Barrett Cooper. Our theme music was composed by Ja'Cory Arthur, with other music licensed from Blue Dot Sessions. Special thanks to Nina Ellis, Louisville Public Media, and to Loretta Williams for editorial guidance. Major support for this series was provided by Archon Construction. Additional support from Jay and Susan Giles, Doreen Juha Sauer, Lopa Mehrotra, and Douglas and Marissa Brown. Many thanks to Julian Schur, Jennifer Weber, Patrick Lewis, Shannon Smith, Chris Phillips, and Eric Jackson, whose interviews were heard in this episode. Please note that the views expressed by Jennifer Weber do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the United States Air Force Academy, the U.S. Air Force, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. If you would like to support our nonprofit organization and unlock bonus episodes of this series, you can do so at patreon.com/reckoningradio. Our first bonus episode explains all the key events in American history that led to the Civil War. You can access that and more at patreon.com/reckoningradio. For transcripts, a bibliography, and other content related to this series, please visit our website at copperheadconspiracy.org. That's copperheadconspiracy.org. And if you haven't already done so, please leave a review of this series on whatever platform you use to hear it. It will really help other listeners to find this podcast. And finally, if you'd like to hear another series we've produced on a related subject, please seek out The Reckoning, Facing the Legacy of Slavery in America. You can find it at reckoningradio.org/podcast. That's reckoningradio.org/podcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much for listening.